So what are we doing in this one? We are in PreCodeCamp's modules. We're talking about React, and this one specifically is building a fruit search app where we're going to be introduced to useEffect is what I am told by the description. If you're new to this channel, my name is Rob. I'm a coding instructor for PreCodeCamp, and this is a series of where we're going through some of the free CodeCamp modules, and we're coming at it from the point of view of an instructor. So you're going to learn some things. You're not just going to copy and paste, but we're going to go look in the documentation. We're going to figure out what it does and why it works, and that way you get more out of it than just going through the lesson by yourself. So if that's something that interests you, then you're watching the right video. And if you could, hit the like button on this video. That really helps out that YouTube algorithm. All right, let's go ahead and dive into what we're going to be making. Okay, so this is what we're making, and it looks like this is an input field, and we have some maybe conditional logic showing that, hey, there's no results found if there's no matches. And when we type in here, maybe I type in AP for apple, we get several fruits that have the letters AP in them. And so I think that's what we're going to be doing with this. And it doesn't look like any of these items are clickable to even finish the word out here. And it looks like we do have a nice little X here to clear everything out. So that's what it looks like we're building here. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so step number one here, it says in previous lectures, we learned about the handling of side effects like data fetching, okay? And we want to utilize this thing here called a useEffect hook. And so in this workshop, we're going to build an application that fetches data from an API, and it's going to be based upon the user input, and the results will be dynamic. So we first want to make our fruit search component, and we want it to return a div element with the ID of search container. So let's go ahead and do that. And so if you've been watching any of the previous videos, we know that anytime we have a functional component on our React, we always want to make sure that one, we are exporting it, B, we are returning a single JSX element. And that's what we're doing right here. So we're just going to type the keyword return, and I'm always going to put some parentheses on here. And then I'm just going to go to the next line here just for visual purposes. And it says that we want to have a div, and then I'm immediately going to close off that div. And that way I don't forget, okay? Because this is a single element that we are trying to return, and it's wrapped in the parentheses, and we have the keyword return. Next, we want to give it the ID of search container. So let's do that. Okay, so I think at this point, that's all we need to do. Also, I would recognize on here that we are automatically already importing useState and useEffect from React. So we already have those things. We're just not using them quite yet. And so I'll explain more about useEffect once we actually are asked to go ahead and type out the function. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations. We're moving on to the next step. So we're in step 2. This one should be, really easy. It just wants us to create the form element inside of the div that we just got done typing out. So this is all at once for right now. Let's go ahead and check our code. All right, let's move on to the next step. So step number 3, it says inside the form element, let's go ahead and add a label element. So let's do that. Again, just doing some opening and closing tags. And the label should say search for fruits. Okay. And the HTML4. So this might be something new because usually you just have something here called for on the element. But because for is a protected word in JavaScript, we have to do HTML4. And then we want to set that equal to search input. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and check our code. Search for fruits. Oh, I misspelled, or I put a capital. Let's go ahead and, there we go. So simple syntax. All right. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so step number 4, it says that it wants us to do an input, and we're going to self-close that off. And the type is going to be search. And then the ID on here is going to be search input. Perfect. Okay. So it looks like we have a nice little input field. It looks like we already have that nice little X in there for us, and we should be good to go from here. Let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so finally we're getting into a little bit of React hooks. And we've already had lessons that talked about state. And just as a reminder here, that when we are doing the state here, we're always going to have a const, and then we're just destructuring this use state function because it returns an array. The first thing that it returns is going to be the read-only variable, which is what that name is currently set to. And then this one is a function that is sole purpose is to update the name. Okay. And so it's telling us here that in React, controlled inputs are a standard way of handling form data, where the input value is synced with the component state. And we can see a little bit of that working right here. And I don't know if they're going to show us some more a little later, but just by having the value set to the read only, I don't see it updating the state. Like I don't see set name anywhere on here. But anyways, what it's asking us to do, it says we're going to learn more about this in a future lesson. It says that in order to track what the user types in the search field, we first must create a state variable. And so go ahead and create one called query, and then also have the follow along of that is set query and the useState hook to be done. So let's go ahead and do this here. So we can come in here and we can do const square brackets, and then it's going to be query and then set query. Now we want to set that equal to useState, and then it has parentheses on here. Now don't forget that we want to initialize this state here. We want to initialize it to empty strings. So that's going to be very important. And that's what it's talking about here is we want to initialize this query to just be blank. So that means when we refresh the page or we start from fresh over here, it doesn't have anything filled inside of it. Okay, let's go and check our code and then see what it's going to have us do next. All right, moving on to the next step. So step number 6 is telling us when the user types in the input field, it's going to give us back a match based upon what kind of fruits did it encounter. And we should probably store that in an array. And so what we want to do now is we're going to create another use state here, and it's going to be titled results and set results. And so hopefully what we're seeing here is that there's this nuance, right? Where there's this naming convention where we are calling the variable, whatever we want to name it here, but then we're just putting the keyword set right in front of it. Okay. So that's what the pattern that we're going to follow here. So we're just going to do const square brackets results and then set results. We want to set that equal to a useState. And this time we want to initialize this as an empty array. Okay. Because I'm foreseeing here that we're going to be conducting a fetch and it's going to give us back an array. And that is what we're going to store that in. All right, let's check our code. All right, let's move on to the next step. So step number 7 here, it wants us, and this is one of the key buzzwords that you're going to pick up on, we talk about this in class as well, is binding. You want to bind the state to the input field. And the value, and this might be something you want to put in your notes. Anytime you have an input field and you have a state, the value is always going to be the read-only portion of the state, okay? So we're going to come down here and we're going to do value. We're going to set that equal to a curly bracket, remember, because we want to reference something. We don't want to put a string quotes around this, and we want to put in the keyword query, okay? Now, you're not going to see anything happen on here as far as the input field, but I'm not able to type in here. And that's why I was talking about earlier when they showed that example of, hey, here's the name and the set name, and this is what we want to use for the input field. Because I didn't see in their code, how are they updating the state? And if we initialize this to hello, we should see hello inside of the input field here, okay? But still, I can't type in here. I can't delete anything. It's not working. And that's because we need to do one more thing when we are utilizing this. And you're going to see this as a pattern that you'll want to follow whenever you're creating these input fields and stuff. All right, let's go ahead and check our code. I don't know if it's going to, I think it's just going to look for what we just added. It's not going to take a look at what above, but it looks like we got it. All right, let's move on to the next step. Okay, so step number 8, this is where the dual binding comes into play. So we want to add an onChange attribute, and this onChange attribute will capture the user's input on what they actually type in. And we can utilize a simple arrow function. We can make it things real simple with using the E and take advantage of the e.target.value for the setter. So it gives us a little bit of an example right here. And almost we can just copy this and paste it right down below. And sometimes you'll see things set up in a way where this might be event. I know we saw another video, or if you watched the other video that we did, we called this event. And you can either call it event, you can call it E, you can call it pool party, you can call it whatever you want. But typically what you'll see in here is an E or an event. And then we can come over here to our setter. What are we setting? We're doing the set query. Okay. And that's really all we needed to change on this. And we can go ahead and change this to event as well. Again, now we can come over here and we can now type, because before we were not able to type because we weren't tracking the change event. And now we are in sync, meaning that whatever the user types, now our state is updating. Okay. So that's all we're doing here. This is a real pattern, simple pattern for you to make sure you copy, put it in your notebook, because you're going to see it over and over again. And the recipe for success with this is on an input field, you're going to have a value, and you're going to set that to the read only portion of the state. And then you're going to have an onChange event happen in order to capture the data that you're typing in. So again, very standard. And this is your setter for your updating of this value. So again, a lot of things to think about, but just know that this is a very common pattern to see in a React project. Let's go ahead and check our code. Oh, it was looking for the actual E. So let's go ahead and update that. There we go. And congratulations. Okay, so it was specifically looking for the E for the argument. Again, you could have called it anything you wanted, and it still worked, as you saw in my test when I was typing things out. Okay, all right, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. All right, so step number 9, it says that we should have our handle submit function up here. So we can just do function handle submit. It should accept an event object. Well, before I got in trouble for typing the keyword event, this time we're going to use a simple E. Okay, and then we're also going to add in an e.prevent default. And so what this does, what the e.prevent default will do is, typically on a form, you're going to hit the send button or hit the enter key, and the form gets submitted, and then the page will render you to a new place, or it will re-render you in the exact same place if you don't put anything in there. And we are trying to prevent the default action that a form has. So we don't need it to actually submit anything. We don't need it to go or redirect us anywhere. So we are just preventing the default of a form. Okay. Now it doesn't want us to put anything else anywhere. I believe we're going to do that in a next step. But as far as right now, I believe that's all that it wants. Let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations. We're moving on to the next step. All right. So step number 10, it says we need to pass off the handle submit function to the form. Okay. And we can do that by coming over here to the form. And we have this attribute on the form for onSubmit. And then all we have to do is pass it the function that we just got done creating. Okay. And I believe that is all that it would require here. Now, let me test something out. So again, what I would typically do in the class to make sure that, hey, our handle submit is working properly, I try to break things down where I'm not putting a bunch of code in here and hoping that it works. I want to test things out as I go along. And a real quick way is you can put a console log in here. You can have it say anything you want. And I'm just going to go ahead and console log the query, which is whatever I typed in here. So if I type an apple, and in order for a form to be submitted, you can have a button or you can hit the Enter key, and you should see it appear down here in the console. So if I do apples, hit the Enter key, you know that this function is being properly called through the onSubmit. Okay, so that was just a real quick test. Let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations, we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so step 11 here says, let's go ahead and add a div element that is below the form. So let's do that. And inside of the div, we need to have an ID, and we're going to set that to results. All right, let's check our code. Congratulations. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so step number 12, it says inside the results element, you're going to find, or what they want you to do is put a ternary in there. We want to check the length of the results. And why do we want to check the length of results? If it's 0, if we don't have any results of a match, then we want to display this right here, which is no results found. Okay. And so a real common usage when we're talking with React is get very familiar with utilizing ternaries and how they work. The other thing that it wants us to do, and why number 12 might be a real problem area for some, which is they want us to map over the items that are a match. Okay. And so we're going to simulate things on both cases to test our logic out. Just because we don't have that API out there doesn't mean that we can't test some results. And so what I'm going to do first is we need to, anytime we do a ternary inside JSX, we need to go ahead and put the curly brackets in here. And then we can go ahead and conduct this ternary. What do we want to check? We want to check the results length. Okay. We want to make sure that, hey, if it's greater than 0, then we want to go ahead and display the list. Eventually, when we want to map through it, right? And for this right now, I'm just going to put a simple paragraph tag, and if we can trigger this to display. So we'll say results found. And then here's where our or condition comes into play. Or it says it wants a paragraph tag of no results found. Okay. And so this is just a real simple ternary. And how can we simulate that we have found some things? And so again, this is where we know from the API that we're going to be getting an array worth of strings, and we can put apple in here. We can put orange in here, and you can automatically see now, because this length is greater than 0, we're seeing results found. But we don't want to do that. We want to map through the results and display what we have inside the list. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to go ahead and cut this to my clipboard, and I'm just going to conduct a map. I'm going to do results.map. And in here, I'm going to do item. I'm going to do an arrow function, and I'm going to paste what I have on my clipboard. And notice that we are effectively looping. Okay. We're looping through this. But where you get the results found, we don't get to see what those items were named. That's a real quick fix. We can come in here and we can put the curly brackets on and type in the keyword item. Because if you remember, when we're mapping through stuff, it's going to take a look at the 0 position first. What's inside there? We call that item. There it is, item. Okay, it's showing apple. Then it moves on to the next part of that array, and it's orange. Okay, now this all looks great, but it says, don't forget about including the key. Now, if we remember, the key is used to make sure that React does not get lost, and it knows exactly what needs to change on the page. Okay. And so we want to pick something that is very unique to this mapping, right? And the one thing that is probably unique on here is because we will not get multiple apples. So we can put the key as item, and that will be something that is unique for it. Okay. So I know this might look funky. Sometimes we can use the index. That's another good key to use. But in order for us to pass this test, I believe this is all that we need to do. So again, the way that we read this in JavaScript is we're taking a look at the length of the array, and we're making a decision. Whatever follows this question mark is truthy, right? So if the length is greater than 0, let's go ahead and map through the list. Otherwise, this is your else. Let's display some text that says no results found. Okay, let's go ahead and check our code. We got the sorry, did not pass. Your results container should contain a list of matching fruits based upon the query and the result item. So let me go ahead and see what we did wrong. So I forgot to add the class on here. So let's go ahead and do that. Class name, and we're going to set that equal to result item. Okay. So I know this code kind of looks funky. Once we hit the submit button, it's going to clean it up for us. There we go. Congratulations. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, so step number 13, it says, next you're going to make your app get fruit names from an API whenever the user types in the input. First, we need to create a useEffect hook that will run every time that the query state changes. Make sure you pass in an arrow function as the first argument into the useEffect, and also include query as the dependency array. So a lot of verbiage on here. We may not know exactly what that means, but we can definitely look at W3 schools and see some examples of what a useEffect hook looks like in working action. And so in here, I really like this part here where it says, here's an example of no dependencies. Now, if you remember in the example that they gave us, it says use the query as a dependency. So this useEffect runs every single render, okay? Many times when we're calling out APIs, and maybe we can test it out in this example. I haven't seen what API we're using, if they're going to time us out or not. But I see a lot of times students will run out of API requests really quickly if they use this right here just alone, okay? Now, this one here, this useEffect will only run on the first render. So once the whole page is all done loading, it will run this effect one time. And usually what I see for this one is maybe you're pulling up a page and it needs to load up some data, but you can't plug in the data into the chart until the page fully loads. And so this is a great way to only run it once. This one here, which is the example that we need, which will run not only on the first render, but any time the dependency value changes. And so what I want us to recognize here is that this useEffect takes a function as the argument. And then we also have down here is when do we want to use this useEffect? When do we want this useEffect to run? And what we're eventually moving towards in our project is anytime somebody starts typing, we want to go ahead and call this API and see if it brings us back any kind of fruit that matches what we're typing in. So that's how we're going about this with this useEffect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and that way it will be something that I can refactor down here. So we want this useEffect, right? We don't want it to run every single time that a prop comma state changes, right? We don't need that part. But what we want to put inside the array here is going to be the query, okay? And that should help us out, because if I do a console log here of effect running or effect ran, okay, so you can see that it ran when the page loaded, right? And then every time I type in here, it will run that effect. And that's how we can test these things out, okay? So it's not about coding blind and hoping that it works. We're trying to code and then test it out. Don't fully put in your logic in here until we make sure that the effect is working, okay? Especially starting out. All right, let's go ahead and check our code. The useEffect hook should use effect. Let's see what's going on here. All right, really had no idea on why it was giving me the error, so I just removed the comments and it seemed to work. All right, now we can move on to the next step. All right, step number 14, it says inside the useEffect callback, go ahead and add an if condition. And so let's go ahead and do that. So if, and then it wants query trim, which means it's going to cut off the white spaces, triple equals empty quotes, which means it's empty. They didn't type anything in there. If that happens, what we want to do is we want to set the results to our basic setup. okay, to our baseline, which is going to be square brackets, okay? Next, it wants us to return if we come down into this if statement. So we don't want to continue any further inside of this useEffect. We don't want to make an empty API call out there just for an empty space. So it's just real quick, in and out, and it's over. Let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations, we're moving on to the next step. Okay, let's go ahead and knock out step number 15. It says, if the query is not empty, you're going to want to get a list of fruits to match the user input from the API, but only after the user stops typing for a short period of time to avoid fetching so frequently, right? Now, it says to start this, we want to go ahead and apply this after the if statement, and we want to call the set timeout to an empty arrow function. And then we want to store this in a variable called timeout ID. So let's just do const timeout ID. And we want to do the set timeout. Usually takes 2 parameters in here. It says an empty arrow function. So left parenthesis, right parenthesis, curly brackets. And then we want that to happen for the 700 milliseconds. Okay. And I think that's all that we need for this. Let's go ahead and check it. Congratulations, we're moving on to the next step. Okay, so we want to update the first argument of the timeout to be an asynchronous arrow function. So we'll just do async, and that's later on so we can probably do some fetching and utilize await. Oh, I guess it says it right there. So this allows us to utilize await within this delayed logic. And then it says inside that function, create a try catch. So we're going to do a try, and then I'm going to hit the enter key here, do a catch. And I believe that's all that it really wants here. Let's go ahead and test this out. Perfect. And so what the try is going to do, it's going to try to do the logic inside there. And if it fails for any reason, or if we have some sort of error, it's going to catch it. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next step. So step number 17, it says inside the try block, go ahead and call the fetch function. And we want to go ahead and store that in a variable called response. And since you're already inside an async function, we can await it before the fetch. So what we want to do here is we want to do a const response, and we want to await the fetch. Okay. What do we want to put inside here? They gave us the code for it. And so we're going to go ahead and apply that. So we want to do the backticks. Perfect. Okay. And I believe that's all at once at this point. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and check our code. Congratulations. We are moving on to the next part. Okay. So we are on step number 18 here. It says next we need to utilize the .json, and we need to utilize that on the response. Okay. And one thing that we need to think about here with this is it is also a promise. And so that's why we have to await it. And it wants us to store it in a variable called data. So what that's going to look like is const data equals response JSON. And then we want that left and right parentheses on there. And then, like I said, because this is a promise, we need to await it. Okay. And I believe that's all that it wants for this. Let's go ahead and check our code. There we go. We got the confetti. Let's go on to the next section here. All right, so we're on step number 19 here, and it says that now that you have the data from the API, let's go ahead and update the results state by calling set results. And we need to pass it an array that contains the name property only. Okay. And I didn't understand what this was looking for, and because we don't have documentation on what does this give us. And so what we're going to do, and this is what I would do in real life for teaching students, is I'm going to say, hey, you know what, let's just go ahead and console log the data and see what we get. So I'm just going to do a real quick console log here, and I need to type in something like apple. Okay. Now notice that I'm getting an array, right? But it has an array of objects. And what this step is wanting us to do is it wants us to remove the name. It wants us to remove the object and only be an array of text strings. That's it. Okay. So how can we do that? Let's just keep on chugging along with this console log here. and see what we get. So we're going to go ahead and do console log of the data, and we want to map over it. Now, whenever we map over it, we can have a function here, and I'm just going to call it item, because every single time we're looping through this array, we're going to call it an item. And I only want to return the name of the item, right? So I'm going to do item.name. And so now when I come over here and I search for it, let me do apple again. Notice that the name is gone. I am strictly getting the fruit names only. I'm not getting an object. I'm getting an array of strings. And so that's what it's wanting us to do. So instead of console logging this, it wants us to do set results. And so that way it is stored in it. Okay. So let's go ahead and check our code, see if that's what it's wanting. The tests are complete and we are ready to move on to the next step. All right, so step number 20, it says for the catch block, let's go ahead and add an error parameter and then use the console.error to log any errors that occur while the fetching or the processing of the data. So how are we going to go about this? So it says it wants a parameter in here, and we are calling this ERROR, which is the error, because it specifically says to type that in there. So if you're getting any kind of errors, like maybe you're used to just typing ERR in there, that's not going to work. It's not going to pass. So make sure that you spell it out completely. And then we're going to console.error, the error. Okay. And that way it will show up in the browser. It will show up red and alert you. One thing I'm going to note on here is that this doesn't handle any kind of server errors that you might run into with fetching with statuses, right? Because you can still error out from a server status code, but this right here doesn't handle it. It will not go down in the catch unless you specifically make it go down there if you are checking for statuses. All right, let's go ahead and check our code. We got the congratulations. We're at 95% with this. So maybe that means just one more step. Let's see. All right, we're on step number 21, and it says below the timeout ID variable, go ahead and write a return cleanup function that clears out the timeout using the clearTimeout function. Okay. This will prevent multiple delayed fetches from stacking up and bubbling up. Yes, very true. Make sure your cleanup function is an arrow function with an implicit return. A real common practice here is for us to come down here and go ahead and type out the keyword return. And this is going to be your cleanup function, meaning like after the component is unmounted, then it's going to run this cleanup effect. And so how this is going to look is an arrow function with the clearTimeout, and we're going to provide it with the timeout ID. Okay, so anytime you create a timer, it's assigned an ID, and then this just allows us to clean it out of the system. It's no longer being tracked. It's no longer being implemented. So anyways, that is what they're looking for here. And it says, and with that, your fruit search app is complete. Go ahead and try it out with the search for an apple. And there we go. We have apple and pineapple displaying naturally in the search box there. Cool. All right, let's check our code. We got the confetti. It looks like we are done. So if you made it this far, I congratulate you. I do want to say thank you so much for watching. Hopefully these videos are not only entertaining, but they also help get you motivated and get you unstuck and just learn a few things. That's all we're asking for. But thank you again for watching, and we love you even more if you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.